Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today is all about ice cream. We all love ice cream, don't we? And I know there are some of you out there that love ice cream way more than others because I read a statistic the other day that said that the average American consumes 48 pints of ice cream a year. Folks, that's 6 gallons. I love ice cream, but I don't eat 6 gallons of it in a year. And that means some of you out there are eating way more than 6 gallons to make up for the extra gallons that I don't consume. If you're new to my channel, I am known for making methods that other people make excessively complicated, much simpler, and even more delicious sometimes than those other, more complicated methods. So today I am going to teach you an incredibly simple ice cream base that we developed at my restaurant across 7 years of experimentation. And it produces the most exquisite, soft, silky, rich ice cream base with practically no effort. If you are new to my channel and only have a TikTok attention span, get the heck off my channel right now. I am the ultimate food geek, people. I'm not gonna sit here and demonstrate in 5 minutes how you make this ice cream and not give you the knowledge of why this ice cream is so incredibly delicious. If you understand the science behind the technique, it not only makes you a smarter person, which makes you a better person, it not only allows you to impress your friends and family with your scientific prowess in the kitchen, but it empowers you to rely less on recipes because you understand how things work, and soon you will be creating your own recipes with the scientific understanding of what is happening behind them. So, invest in yourself, watch the whole video, and you're gonna learn some really cool stuff, I promise. Today I am teaching you an ice cream base recipe, or basically vanilla ice cream. And this recipe is going to be used as the foundation for your favorite flavors of ice cream. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate a bunch of different recipes based on this ice cream base, but if you go to my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, or just click directly on the link in the video description below, I will have these specific recipes for all sorts of variations on this recipe, both popular and a little bit weird, like smoked cinnamon ice cream. And if that sounds intriguing, it will be the best ice cream you have ever tasted in your entire life. But today, I'm just teaching you the base. This is a scalable base. It produces enough ice cream base to make about 2 quarts of ice cream. So you are going to scale this recipe, like double it or triple it, based on the capacity of your own ice cream maker. Okay, let's get right into it. I am going to assemble this ice cream base inside my blender container. If you don't have a blender at home, you can certainly assemble this base in a bowl. In that case, you're gonna need to use either a stick blender, a hand mixer, or you can certainly use a whisk. It's just gonna require a lot more muscle. If you have a large thermos capable of holding about 2 quarts of liquid that has a sealable lid, you can do this inside that thermos and then shake it to incorporate the ingredients, and that works just as well. But the thing that makes this ice cream base virtually effortless and take me less than 5 minutes to whip up is the fact that I do it in my blender. You'll also notice that I'm going to use a scale to weigh my ingredients. First of all, that's because I'm lazy and I don't like washing measuring cups, especially measuring cups that have had honey or corn syrup in them. If you bake at all, you really must have a scale in your kitchen. But folks, even when I am not baking, my scale comes out of the drawer almost every single day. I use it all over the kitchen, both for sweet and savory dishes. If you want to get my favorite scale, I've linked to this in the video description below. Just click where it says more right underneath this video. And for those of you that don't have a scale, don't worry, I am also going to give you this ingredient in cup measurements. All right, our first ingredient is a can of evaporated milk. This is not sweetened condensed milk. They are 2 very distinctly different things. Evaporated milk has had a significant portion of the water content of milk evaporated out of it through heat. This gives us a number of benefits in ice cream. First of all, the less water we have in our ice cream, the smoother the overall texture will be. When water freezes, it produces large crystals. And the last thing we want is for our ice cream to have a gritty, crystally texture. We want it to be velvet smooth, and to do that we want to minimize the amount of water in our overall ice cream. However, we can't make our ice cream entirely with heavy cream, because then it's cloyingly rich, it sticks to your tongue, and after a couple of spoonfuls of it, you stop tasting it. So the solution here is to turn to evaporated milk. The second quality this contributes to our ice cream is that through the heating process that evaporates the water out of the milk, We also get some caramelization of the milk sugars, the lactose that are in the milk. When you open up this can, you're going to notice that it's a little bit darker than regular milk, and that is because the lactose has caramelized. Caramelized flavors are deeper and richer and more complex. So, lots of benefits to using evaporated milk. Shake your can of evaporated milk, open it up, and it goes into your container. Now I'm turning on my scale and we are going to add 6 ounces or 3/4 of a cup of white sugar. There are variations on this recipe where you may decide to use brown sugar instead of white, and we'll talk about that later. Next, we are going to add 6 ounces of corn syrup. And yes, corn syrup is actually fairly critical to the final texture of our ice cream. We're going to talk about the science behind that a little bit later in this video. It's important when you buy corn syrup to look at the ingredients list and make sure that it does not contain high fructose corn syrup. While the FDA thinks high fructose corn syrup is no worse for you than regular sugar, I actually don't believe that. And we've had a number of studies that seem to indicate that our bodies have more difficulty metabolizing high fructose corn syrup. Now, it's true that corn syrup is an industrial ingredient. It's not just the squeezings from corn. Basically, corn starch is extracted from field corn, and starches are actually complex sugars. They're made up of simple sugars that are bound together into a starch molecule, exactly like there's a bunch of starch bound up in the wheat seed that's ground into flour. So they take that starch and expose it to enzymes that convert the starch into glucose, its component sugar. Now, if that sounds scary, we do the exact same thing when we bake bread all the time. When we wet flour, the natural enzymes in the flour convert the starch molecules into simple sugars, which our yeast digest. This process is called autolysis. And if you've ever heard of an autolyse process while making bread, it's the exact same thing. So that's how they get corn syrup from corn. No doubt it is an industrial product, but it's not quite as bad for you as high fructose corn syrup. Now, if it really bothers you to use this, there are a couple of more natural sweeteners that you can use in this ice cream, the most notable one being honey. If you're using honey, you can add 6 ounces of honey. Of course, this is going to make your ice cream taste like honey, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but not everybody's looking for that honey flavor in specific flavors of ice cream. You can also use maple syrup to sweeten your ice cream, and if that's the case, 5 ounces of maple syrup, which is about 3/4 of a cup. Again, that is going to make your ice cream taste like maple, which would be delicious in a butter pecan ice cream, a flavor that I'm famous for, but might not necessarily be so appropriate in like a strawberry ice cream. Agave nectar will also work, but agave nectar is incredibly sweet and it's actually a fairly industrialized process that is used to produce it. If you use agave nectar, I would only use 4 ounces, which is about half of a cup. But regardless, we need some sugar to sweeten our ice cream that is different from table sugar, because table sugar is a complex sugar, sucrose. These liquid sugars that I've mentioned are simple sugars, glucose and fructose, and those are very, very important for the final texture of our ice cream, which we'll talk about later. As you've noticed, I keep my corn syrup stored upside down in the pantry so that it comes out immediately. We are going to be adding 6 ounces of corn syrup. I had literally 6 ounces left in the bottle. Now we're going to add about 2 tablespoons of vanilla extract. The higher quality vanilla you use, the better your ice cream will taste. If you have to resort to artificial vanilla because of the cost factor, I completely understand. One of these days I'm going to do an entire video series on vanilla because it is a fascinating product. It's made from the seed pod of a rare orchid. It has to be hand pollinated, and then it takes months of careful fermentation at specific temperatures and humidities, every part of the process done by hand, to transform that orchid seed pod into the crazily aromatic spice that we know as vanilla. And we actually might not have vanilla around in another 10 or 15 years because of climate change, so enjoy it while you can, folks. All right, I am going to add about 2 tablespoons of this vanilla extract. I don't measure it, but if that bothers you, you're certainly welcome to measure it. There's 1 and 2. Now, of course, there may be some ice cream flavors where you specifically don't want the flavor of vanilla being this pronounced, or you may not want any vanilla at all. Of course, that's up to you. Now we're going to add a pinch of salt. Any type will do. And we are going to mix or blend this either by hand or by electricity until all of that sugar is dissolved. And now we are going to add our final ingredient, which is a pint of heavy cream. We didn't add the heavy cream in the beginning because we actually don't want the cream to separate and start turning into butter inside our mix. There's not really that much risk of that, but I prefer to just basically stir this in here at the end. Now I'm going to give this just a couple of gentle pulses to combine. That is it. How easy was that? Now this is ready to go straight into the freezer, or you can chunk it in the fridge overnight to freeze the next day. Now, I know some of you are asking, where are the eggs? Folks, technically, ice cream is frozen cream. Once you invite eggs to this party, what you're making is frozen custard. Now don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with adding egg yolks or even whole eggs to your ice cream base. But in order to officially comply with food safety protocols, we have to heat those eggs to a certain pasteurization temperature in order to neutralize any potential pathogens that might be inside the eggs. Now, that's especially important if you are using factory-produced eggs that you get off the shelf at the supermarket. If you've got chickens in your backyard like I do, you can feel free to use your eggs however you see fit. Eggs are typically added to ice cream to up the fat content, which results in a more luxurious feel on the palate as you eat the ice cream. It also helps the ice cream remain a little bit softer at freezer temperatures. But with this particular recipe, I have achieved a perfect balance between simple component sugars, namely glucose, and the natural fat that's existing in the heavy cream and the evaporated milk, and it results in an exquisite ice cream that really doesn't need any additional saturated fat. If you've ever made an ice cream from scratch that calls for egg yolks, you know how complicated it is. Basically, you have to heat your ice cream base until it's hot and steamy. Then you have to beat some of that hot liquid into the egg yolks to temper them. Then you pour the tempered egg yolks back into your ice cream base and heat it on the stovetop until it begins to thicken, which brings it to that temperature at which we know we have safely pasteurized those egg yolks. Then we have to cool that base back down in the fridge before we can freeze it. You don't have to do all that, people. This ice cream base without any egg yolks is way easier and just as delicious, I promise. If though, after making this ice cream base, you seem to be missing a little bit of richness, the solution is to add 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter melted to this base right now at this point. Immediately blend that melted butter into the base, which emulsifies it before it has a chance to solidify. Butter is, of course, milk fat that's been extracted and concentrated, and this extra addition of milk fat to this recipe makes an ice cream that's just unbelievably good. But the reason I don't use it as my standard base is simply because of health reasons. If you people are going to be eating 6 gallons of ice cream, ain't no need to be adding extra butter to it, okay? Save the butter for a special occasion and use this as your everyday ice cream base. Now see how easy this came together with a scale? I don't have a single measuring cup to wash. Now, once you play around with this recipe a little bit, you'll discover that it can be modified in endless ways in order to produce the exact flavor of ice cream that you have there in the back of your mind. And of course, it's ready to go as is if you're adding things like chocolate chips or nuts. Of course, it's a better idea to toast your nuts. And if you'll toast your nuts in the microwave instead of in a pan or in the oven, there's far less risk of actually burning or scorching them. Just do it in 30-second increments, stirring between each increment until they're sizzly and aromatic. Then spread them out on a baking sheet and let them fully cool before you add them to your ice cream. Additions like this should be added after the ice cream is frozen while it's still soft, after you've transferred the frozen ice cream to its container. For other additions, consider adding 2 cups of chopped or pureed fruit if you're making a strawberry ice cream or a peach ice cream, or, like my grandpa's favorite, banana ice cream. I like to leave my bananas until they are almost black on the countertop, then chunk them in the freezer until I've got enough to make ice cream. 2 cups of banana puree in this ice cream base makes a fabulous banana ice cream. If you're wanting to change the base itself so that the fundamental flavor is no longer vanilla, you'll want to add that to the base as you are mixing it up. If you're wanting chocolate ice cream, start with 1 cup of melted dark or milk chocolate. You can use chocolate chips, but chocolate chips have waxy binders in them that allow them to stay firm and solid at room temperature. So I prefer to use premium baking chocolate. You can find baking chocolate in most grocery stores in the baking section, but if you can find a supermarket that has a really good bulk section, you'll probably find several different types of baking chocolate in different grades of intensity. If you're on a budget, you can also make a very intense chocolate syrup using plain old cocoa. A cup of sugar, half a cup of cocoa, and a few drops of water will get you started. Simmer it on the stovetop until it's nice and smooth. Fully cool it before adding it to your ice cream base. And in this case, since we were using a full cup of sugar in the chocolate syrup, you would want to eliminate the 6 ounces or 3/4 of a cup of sugar called for in the base recipe. Think about this if you are adding any other additions to this base that are exceptionally sweet. And if you need to back off on the amount of sweetener in the base recipe to compensate for a sweet addition, make sure you're taking that out of the granulated sugar addition to the recipe and not the corn syrup, because that simple glucose in the corn syrup is very, very important to the texture of our ice cream. One of my all-time favorites is coffee ice cream, so consider to this base adding a 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup of instant espresso or instant coffee, dissolved in a couple of tablespoons of hot water, depending on the intensity of the flavor that you want in your ice cream. For tons of other modifications, just check the link to my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, in the video description directly below this video. Now, in the 43 odd years that I have been active in the kitchen, I have used virtually every single ice cream maker that has ever been invented, from the old-fashioned hand crank machine that later evolved into a plug-in electric machine that requires you to use ice and rock salt, to the ones that use the frozen canister that lives in your freezer and then you attach it to your stand mixer or to its own little unique device that makes it spin around. But folks, we have evolved since that time. So I want to introduce you to the 2 ice cream machines that are the workhorses of my ice cream production, because you might decide it should be on your Christmas list for next year. Or maybe you should just gift it to yourself today. Because if you really love ice cream enough to eat 6 gallons of it a year, you probably deserve to have a modern ice cream maker in your kitchen. Now, the one that I use 90% of the time that has really changed my life in the kitchen since I bought it is this compressor ice cream maker. This does not need ice or rock salt. It does not take up unneeded space in my freezer. I plug it in, I pour in my ice cream base, I push a button, and it makes ice cream for me. How beautiful does that sound? For those of you that are dealing with adding ice and rock salt to your ice cream maker 6 times before and then having to figure out something to do with all of that salty ice at the end. Folks, this thing is a lifesaver. There are several companies that manufacture these in a variety of sizes, but the company that I have trusted for my last 2 ice cream makers is Winter. They make this model, which will produce about 2 quarts of ice cream base in about 45 minutes. And when I need to make a bigger batch, I just freeze multiple batches in succession. This current model is about 5 years old, and I used it at my restaurant for 2 of those years. The previous model I wore out over 5 years at my restaurant. Now, these models typically run between $200 and $300. But if you're spending $5 to $7 on a pint of Ben & Jerry's, you're spending $50 a gallon on ice cream, people. And if you're a 6-gallon-a-year eater, that's $300 worth of ice cream right there. So, while spending $300 on a machine like this might initially feel like it hurts your pocketbook, if you are regularly buying ice cream at the supermarket, this is a smarter economic decision. I will link to the current model of Winter's compressor ice cream maker in the video description below. Just click where it says more if you're interested in checking it out. I promise you, you will never look back. We're actually going to use this machine in just a minute to freeze my ice cream base, and you'll be surprised how quiet it is compared to the old crank machines. The newest kid on the ice cream block is the Ninja Creamy. You may have seen it at the big box stores in the kitchen appliance section. This is a cheap plastic knockoff of a very expensive machine that we used to use in the commercial kitchen called a PacoJet. Basically, this thing is an ice cream shaver. You freeze your ice cream base solid in the freezer in these small containers like this. Then the container goes inside the creamy. Then a super sharp blade inside this machine travels down through this container, shaving off minute bits of that frozen solid ice cream base. It turns a hard block of ice cream into a velvety smooth texture in a matter of seconds. This machine would be quite advantageous for a household of only 1 or perhaps 2 people who aren't consuming vast quantities of ice cream at a time. This is because no matter how perfect our ice cream texture is, the longer it sits in the freezer, the more coarse and granular the texture is going to be. This is because ice crystals within that ice cream base are going to grow in size regardless of the amount of sugar or fat you have in that ice cream base. Ice cream goes bad in the freezer if you don't eat it. With the Creamy, you're basically reprocessing your ice cream every single time you use it. So if your base has been in the freezer for 6 months and it is hard and crystallized as heck, you put it in this machine and in seconds, you have a perfectly smooth ice cream. The other benefit of this machine is the ability to achieve unearthly smooth textures to frozen liquids that may not have fat or sugar in them at all. Take sorbets, for instance. Sorbets are simply fruit juices that have been frozen, and the water content in these juices is much higher and the sugar content is much lower than ice cream, and they have no fat at all. This means that sorbets typically freeze up with a much coarser texture than ice cream. The beauty of this thing is that it shaves those crystals so incredibly fine that if you just freeze a container of nothing but orange juice and put it in here, 1 scoop of that orange sorbet will give you the same texture as the most velvety, rich, sweet ice cream on planet Earth. Now think about this. If you're diabetic and you have to use 0-calorie sugars, these sweeteners do not give us the advantage that simple sugars do in terms of texture. If you've used Splenda or aspartame or stevia to sweeten your ice cream base and you freeze it, you'll notice that it is much coarser and more granular than an ice cream base made with glucose. Corn syrup. The way commercial manufacturers get around this is that they add all sorts of emulsifiers and conditioners, chemicals basically, to sugar-free ice cream to make it smoother and creamier. And if you're already trying to eat healthier and lower your sugar content, why would you want a bunch of extra chemicals in your ice cream? It's not called creamy for no reason. With the creamy, you can have velvet, smooth ice cream with absolutely no added sugars. So if you're diabetic, but you love ice cream, this is a machine you really might want to consider giving some thought to. This baby costs around $200, so it's cheaper than the compressor ice cream maker. But the drawback to the creamy is, this is the most ice cream you're ever gonna have at one time. And if you're needing to feed a crowd, you gotta have 8 or 10 of these containers and process each one of them when it's time to feed everybody. I use my creamy primarily to produce really extraordinarily creamy sorbets, in which case I'm only serving folks 1 small little scoop at a time. So 1 container will serve 12 people. All right, now it is time to freeze. I'm gonna turn on my machine, pour my base into the container. As you were pouring in your base, make sure you were adding room for the ice cream to expand. Not only do all liquids expand when they freeze, but the ice cream maker incorporates air into the base as it freezes. So you are going to get a significant amount of expansion inside your ice cream maker. For this 2-quart model, I have obviously tailored this specific recipe to make 1 perfect batch. So if I was going to feed a crowd, I would double or triple the ice cream and just freeze 2 or 3 batches. The nice thing about this guy is that it can go all day long, batch after batch after batch without needing a rest, which is super cool. All right. Now I turn her on, and in about 45 minutes, we will have perfectly frozen soft serve. Now, you'll notice I'm standing right next to it, and I'm sure the mic is picking up the sound from this machine. The good thing about it is that it is actually significantly quieter than both my stand mixer and my old-fashioned ice cream maker that uses ice and rock salt. I have no wall between my kitchen and my living room, and I can watch TV or a movie while this is running without very much distraction at all. Now, I am the ultimate food geek, which means we're about to get some science up in here, and don't you dare skip ahead. You know I can see when you do that, right? My metrics show me. Folks, the reason you watch my channel is because I make it easy and fun to understand what's happening when you cook. This means if you make a recipe and it fails, you will understand why without being just left in the dark and thinking it was a terrible recipe. Every time you skip ahead over the easy and fun science in my videos, not only does it make you fractionally stupider, but it leaves me up in my bed all alone weeping as I watch you jumping right over it to get to the end of the video. So sit back for a few seconds and let's figure out why a recipe this easy with absolutely no eggs turns into an ice cream that is so incredibly delicious. Our goal for the perfect ice cream is a creamy, smooth, rich ice cream that is scoopable even if it's been in the freezer for several days. And to do that, we need to understand the concept of freezing points. Now, our ice cream has got basically 4 major ingredients in it. We've got fat, water, sugar, and protein. Each of these substances has their own freezing point. Let's think about it. Water. What's the freezing point here? Well, we all know that it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. That is the temperature at which pure liquid water becomes solid. How about sugar? Well, sugar is actually already solid. That means it's frozen. The melting point of sugar is actually sky high. About 300 degrees Fahrenheit is when it starts to melt. That means anything colder than about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's already frozen. Now, granted, when we add sugar into water, it becomes a liquid, but technically at the molecular level, it is still frozen, even when it's dissolved in water. That is going to be one of our tricks. We've also got protein in our ice cream base, and this is whey protein, and it looks like, yeah, it's already frozen at room temperature too. So even though it is dissolved in our ice cream base, it is still frozen and we don't really have to worry about it. The last component of our ice cream is fat, butter fat or milk fat in this case. This stick of butter has been sitting out at room temperature for a couple hours and guess what? It's frozen, folks. Now, to be fair, it is soft, but the reason it's soft is not because the fat isn't frozen. The fat is frozen, but the water inside the butter is melted because it is room temperature, and water is liquid at room temperature. Believe it or not, folks, this stick of butter you get from the grocery store is 15% water. And at room temperature, that water is a liquid just like this. But thanks to the protein structure in this butter, the protein is holding the solid frozen butterfat molecules together, trapping the liquid water inside of it. So the water acts as sort of a lubricant, which is why room temperature butter is soft and you can crush it between your fingers. If you put this stick of butter in the freezer, it becomes rock solid, but that's not because the fat molecules are getting more frozen. That's really because the 15% of this that's water, which is liquid right now at room temperature, turns into a solid when it is frozen at freezer temperatures. So if we could somehow convince frozen protein molecules to bind together frozen fat molecules around frozen sugar molecules, but enough liquid water, we could have an ice cream that's rich and smooth and delicate and creamy like butter is at room temperature. But how do we do that? Because since once water reaches freezing temperatures, it is hard as a rock. Well, we do this in two ways. The first way that we do that is thanks to the rotating agitation of the dasher inside the ice cream maker. Because the mix is constantly being churned, as the ice crystals form, they don't really have a chance to bind together, which is what happens here, folks. This also starts with tiny little crystals that form, but because the water is still, those crystals join together and network into a big, hard, angry block. Inside our ice cream maker, those crystals are kept apart and constantly in motion, so they can't freeze together into a big, hard block. But if that was the only way we prevented the ice cream from getting super hard, we would have to keep that ice cream continuously moving even after it was in the freezer. Otherwise, it would turn into a solid, hard block. Think about soft serve machines. They are constantly rotating that so that ice cream, even though it's very, very cold, always stays nice and soft. We have to figure out some other way to prevent the ice cream from turning into that hard as a rock block once it's in the freezer. And there are several ways that we do this. The first way we do it is by minimizing the amount of water in the recipe in the first place. Milk, which is a fundamental ingredient in most ice creams, is 87 to 88% water. That's a lot of water, folks. Heavy cream is only about 57% water. But we can't only use heavy cream because as it churns, the milk fat will actually separate and turn into butter. So heavy cream isn't at the right ratio of fat to water. It's got too much fat and too little water. That's where evaporated milk comes in, because evaporated milk is about 60% water. It has had that larger share of its water evaporated out of it. And as I mentioned earlier, when they cook this to remove the extra water, some of that lactose or milk sugar ends up caramelizing, which gives it a nice complex flavor. But since we're talking about sugar, sugar is the primary tool that we use to make sure our ice cream is soft even at freezer temperatures. But the type of sugar is absolutely critical in determining the final texture of our ice cream. We are going to use sugar as a tool to lower the freezing temperature of our water. I don't know if you've ever paid much attention to this, but did you know that seawater freezes at a much, much lower temperature than 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit? This is why up in Alaska, when it's 28 degrees below zero in the wintertime, the sea is still sloshing around and you can take a boat out on it. This is not primarily because of salt. It's primarily because when we dissolve basically any solid inside of a liquid, we're incorporating that solid into the liquid, and thus it takes a lower temperature to make that liquid become a solid. We can do that with sugar, just the exact same way we can do it with salt. So the goal then is to cram so much sugar into this water that the water basically can't freeze. Now, of course, in the kitchen, we have a variety of sugars available for us to use, and this recipe does include table sugar or sucrose. However, sucrose is a complex, heavy sugar molecule. It is made up of multiple simple sugars tied together. So if you look at the molecular drawing for a molecule of sucrose, it's huge, at least compared to the simpler sugar structures of glucose and fructose. Of course, we've got plenty of naturally occurring lactose in our cream and our evaporated milk, and that's also a very simple sugar structure. But if the sucrose molecule is so big and the glucose and fructose molecules are so small, how many of these molecules do you think we can cram into any set amount of water? More of the small ones than we can of the big ones, right? That is why this recipe contains a healthy amount of corn syrup, because corn syrup is predominantly glucose, a simpler sugar, and we can dissolve more of this into any equivalent amount of water than we can of this. That's why this is so important to the success of this recipe. Now, I know some of you don't like this. You feel like this is a weird industrial product, and you're right. But they've been making it since the mid-1800s, so it's not some weird, creepy, like radioactive nuclear process. But there's no need to be scared of using plain old glucose-containing corn syrup because it is the secret to why this recipe succeeds. As I mentioned before, you can also use honey instead of corn syrup. Honey has a somewhat similar glucose profile to corn syrup, and so it will behave similarly in the recipe. If you use agave nectar, this is primarily fructose, and we know that fructose also dissolves very well in water and performs exquisitely in terms of lowering water's freezing temperature. Maple syrup, on the other hand, is predominantly this stuff, folks, sucrose. So if you're adding maple syrup instead of corn syrup, expect your ice cream to be more solid as it sits in the freezer. But, you might ask, how exactly does fructose and glucose keep water from freezing at freezing temperatures? Well, the answer is super cool. If you watch your ice cream as it churns, you'll see that that dasher is scraping frozen ice cream base from the walls of the freezing container. What's happening is, as the base gets pushed up against that ice-cold wall, some of the water in the ice cream base does instantly turn into tiny little crystals. But when that crystal forms, it pushes out all the stuff that's dissolved in it, because remember, that stuff is already solid. Even though this looks like a liquid, it is actually a solid dissolved in a liquid. So the sugar itself in this is still a solid. It is frozen at room temperature. So when that ice crystal forms, it pushes out that solid glucose back into the ice cream mix. That glucose then immediately redissolves in the liquid water that's remaining in the mix. So as more and more of these tiny ice crystals are formed, the remaining liquid water gets more and more supersaturated with glucose. And of course, we know that the more solids are dissolved in the water, the lower that freezing temperature gets. And at some point, we reach this magical place at which there is so much glucose dissolved in the remaining water that the remaining water will not freeze at freezer temperatures. It remains a liquid. And if we have enough protein in our ice cream base, all of this stuff arranges itself magically to where we have solid fat crystals bridged by solid protein structures. And inside, they have trapped our sugar, our tiny little ice crystals, and the liquid water that is hypersaturated with glucose remains a liquid, just like it does in our soft room temperature butter. And that hypersaturated sugary liquid that is still liquid even at freezer temperatures is the key to having a perfect ice cream that is scoopable and lickable straight out of the freezer. But we need all of these four things to be in a perfectly harmonious ratio. If we add too much fat, the fat coats our tongue and then we stop tasting the ice cream after a few bites. Add too much sugar and the ice cream will never be firm enough to hold itself in a scoop. Also, too much sugar can be cloying on our tongue. If it's too sweet, we can't taste the other flavors in the ice cream. So through years of experimentation at my restaurant, I discovered this simple ratio results in a perfect ice cream that remains soft enough to scoop at freezer temperatures, but does not rely on the extra fat content that is normally provided by eggs in traditional ice cream recipes. And the eggs are the problem. So there you have it, folks, the science and magic of ice cream laid bare for you to fully understand. Now let's get to freezing. 45 to 50 minutes later, I hear my machine starting to struggle a little bit with the thicker ice cream base as it freezes, and that's when it's time to stop. Now I've had my container in the freezer already, which is why it looks a little bit frosted. It's just smarter to remove frozen ice cream into a cold container rather than into a room temperature container, which will start to melt it faster. Beautiful ice cream, nice and thick, not even pourable at this temperature. And then I scrape it out into my container. Of course, if I'm freezing multiple batches, I'll just go ahead and refill this container and turn the machine back on. But once I'm done, I don't have to deal with a whole bunch of salty ice, and all I gotta do is wash out this container and put the whole thing back in the garage. This ice cream is gonna go into my freezer for a few hours to firm up just a bit before serving time. My ice cream has now been in the freezer for 5 full days, and y'all, I've been fighting people off of it to make sure we could do this experiment here at the end of the video. So I'm gonna pull it out and we're gonna see how scoopable it is. As you can see, some folks have already torn into it, but we still have enough left for us to do our taste test. Got a nice ice cream scoop here, and it comes out with practically no effort at all. And here we go. Y'all, this is velvet smooth. There is absolutely no hint of crystallization whatsoever, even after almost a week in the freezer. You know how we normally use the term vanilla to describe something that's plain or boring? This ice cream is anything but that. And folks, 6 simple ingredients that you can stir together in the blender and immediately freeze without having to worry about cooking eggs? You're welcome. Check the video description below for all sorts of variations on this base to start you on your own journey of making your own favorite flavors of ice cream using it. You can also get a free printable recipe on my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com. Folks, if you found this video valuable, I really hope you'll click that subscribe button. You have no idea how important that is to me. The more subscribers I have, the more time I have to take off from my regular day job and make these really cool, fun videos that help you become more adept in the kitchen. But for now, it's time for me to finish this ice cream cone. So I'm signing off. I'm Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Thanks for watching.